There are disappearances that leave behind questions, and then there are disappearances that leave behind silence. In the autumn of 1891, in a farming settlement 23 miles west of Springfield, Illinois, a man named Thomas Everett Caldwell vanished from his own home. He was 41 years old, a widower, a carpenter by trade, father to 2 daughters, ages 9 and 14. He had lived in that house for 11 years. He knew every creak in the floorboards, every draft that came through the walls in winter. On the morning of October 17th, his daughters woke to find his bed empty, his boots still by the door, and the kitchen table set for 3. The stove was cold. The house was silent. Thomas Caldwell was gone. What makes this case different from the hundreds of other rural disappearances recorded in that era is not what was missing, but what was left behind. The Caldwell home sat on the edge of a modest plot of farmland, bordered by cottonwood trees and a gravel road that led into town. It was a simple 2-story structure, wood-framed with a slanted roof and a small loft accessible only by ladder. The kind of house built by a man who worked with his hands and expected nothing from the world but what he could build himself. Thomas had been a quiet man. That much is confirmed by census records, church logs, and the few surviving letters written by his eldest daughter, Margaret, years later. Neighbors described him as reliable, reserved, a man who attended Sunday service but never lingered for conversation. He paid his debts. He kept his yard clean. He raised his daughters alone after his wife, Clara, died of fever in 1887. The girls were his entire world. Margaret, 14 at the time, had begun helping with the sewing and cooking. The younger daughter, Lily, was still small enough to believe her father could fix anything. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, there had been no fights, no debts called in, no threats, no reason, as far as anyone knew, for Thomas Caldwell to leave. And yet, there had been something. Margaret mentioned it only once, in a letter she wrote to a cousin in 1909, 18 years after her father disappeared. The letter was discovered in an estate sale in Decatur in 1954, tucked inside a Bible. In it, she writes, "He had become strange in those final weeks, not angry, not ill, but distant, as though listening to something the rest of us could not hear." She described how he would stand at the base of the ladder to the loft, staring upward, sometimes for minutes at a time. How he would wake in the night and walk through the house with a candle, checking the windows, the doors, the corners of rooms where nothing had changed. When she asked him what was wrong, he only said, "I need to be sure." Sure of what? She never learned. The loft had always been storage. Old furniture, broken tools, trunks filled with Clara's belongings that Thomas could not bring himself to sell or burn. It was a cramped, low-ceilinged space, dusty and dim, lit only by a single window facing west. Thomas had not been up there in years, but in the 2 weeks before he disappeared, he went up almost every evening. Margaret could hear him moving things, dragging something heavy across the floor. She heard the scrape of wood, the soft thud of objects being set down with care. Once she heard him speaking, low, firm, as though addressing someone. When she climbed halfway up the ladder and called to him, he told her to go back down. His voice was not unkind, but it was final. On the evening of October 16, 1891, Thomas Caldwell ate supper with his daughters, fried potatoes, bread, a little salted pork. Margaret later recalled that he seemed calm, perhaps more calm than he had been in weeks. He asked Lily about her schoolwork. He complimented Margaret on the mending she had done. After the meal, he stood, kissed both girls on the head, and told them to get to bed early. "Tomorrow will be a long day," he said. Neither of them thought to ask why. That night, Margaret woke to the sound of the ladder being moved. She lay in the dark, listening. Footsteps, slow, deliberate, crossing the floor above her head. Then, silence. She waited for him to come back down. He never did. When the sun rose on October 17th, Margaret climbed the ladder herself. The loft was empty. The window was closed. On the floor in the center of the room, there was a wool blanket, folded neatly into a square. Beside it, a single candle, burned down to a stub. And near the far wall, where the roof slanted lowest, a stack of letters, written in her father's hand. All of them addressed to Clara. His wife, dead for 4 years. To understand what happened in that house, you have to understand the man who lived there. Thomas Everett Caldwell was born in 1850 in a small town along the Ohio River. His father was a millwright. His mother died when he was 6. He learned carpentry young, the way most boys did back then, by necessity, not choice. By the time he was 16, he could frame a barn in 2 days and build a door that would hang true for 50 years. He met Clara Houghton in 1875 at a church social in Bloomington. She was 22, soft-spoken, dark-haired, a seamstress, with steady hands and a quiet laugh. They married that same year and moved west to the farmland outside Springfield, where Thomas found work building homes for the new settlers flooding into central Illinois. They had Margaret in 1877, Lily in 1882. For a time it seemed Thomas Caldwell had built himself a life that would last. But Clara was never strong. She had always been prone to headaches, to long stretches of fatigue that kept her in bed for days. The doctors called it nerves, weakness of constitution. They bled her twice and told Thomas to keep her calm. After Lily was born, the fatigue worsened. She would sit by the window for hours, staring out at nothing, her sewing untouched in her lap. Margaret, even as a child, learned to move quietly around her mother. In the spring of 1887, Clara caught a fever. It came on fast, burning skin, shallow breath, eyes that would not focus. Thomas sat beside her bed for 3 days, wetting her lips with a cloth, whispering promises he could not keep. She died on a Tuesday morning just after dawn. Thomas buried her in the churchyard under a simple wooden marker. He did not cry at the funeral. He did not speak. He stood with his daughters on either side of him, staring down at the turned earth, and when it was over, he walked them home in silence. That night, he went into the loft and did not come down until morning. For the next 4 years, Thomas raised his daughters alone. He worked, he cooked, he mended their dresses when the seams split and taught Margaret how to keep the stove going through the night. He was not affectionate, he had never been, but he was present, steady, the kind of father who showed love through labor, through the house he kept standing and the food he put on the table. But there were cracks, small ones at first. Margaret noticed that he no longer slept through the night. She would wake to find him sitting at the kitchen table, fully dressed, staring at the wall. Sometimes he would be holding one of Clara's old hair combs, turning it over in his hands. When she asked if he was all right, he would nod and tell her to go back to bed. He began spending more time in the loft. At first, it was just an hour here and there, organizing Clara's things, he said, putting the past in order. But by the summer of 1891, he was going up almost every evening, staying until the candle burned out. Lily asked him once what he was doing up there. He smiled, thin, distant, and said, "Fixing something." The neighbors noticed the change, too. Thomas had always been a man who kept to himself, but in those final months, he became something more than solitary. He became absent. He would stand in the middle of the road, staring at nothing, until someone called his name. He stopped attending church. He stopped taking carpentry jobs, even though the family needed the money. One afternoon in late September, a farmer named Jacob Rourke came by to ask if Thomas could repair a wagon wheel. He found him standing in the yard, looking up at the roof of his house. Rourke asked what he was looking at. Thomas did not answer right away. Then he said quietly, "I think she's still here." Rourke assumed he meant a memory. A ghost in the metaphorical sense, the kind of presence a man feels after loss. He did not ask for clarification. He left without mentioning the wagon wheel again. Margaret tried to talk to him. She was old enough by then to see that something was wrong. She had watched her father grow thinner, quieter, more distant. She had listened to him pacing the floor at night, heard him whispering to himself in the loft. One evening, she worked up the courage to ask, "Papa, are you sick?" He looked at her for a long moment, as though deciding whether to answer truthfully. Then he shook his head. "No, Margaret, I'm not sick." "Then what's wrong?" He set down the cup of coffee he had been holding and folded his hands on the table. "I made a mistake," he said, "a long time ago, and I need to make it right." She waited for him to explain. He did not. The letters he had been writing, the ones Margaret would later find in the loft, were not love letters. They were confessions. In them, Thomas wrote about the night Clara died, about how he had prayed, harder than he had ever prayed in his life, for God to spare her, about how, in his desperation, he had made a promise. What that promise was, the letters do not say. But in the final letter, dated October 15th, 1891, 2 days before he disappeared, Thomas wrote, "I know now that I cannot keep running from what I owe. The time has come to pay what was promised. Forgive me, Clara. Forgive me for waiting so long." On the night of October 16th, after supper, Thomas Caldwell climbed the ladder to the loft for the last time. Margaret heard him moving above her. She heard the scrape of wood. She heard his voice, low, steady, speaking to someone who was not there. And then, silence. October 16th, 1891, was a cold night. The kind of cold that settles into the bones before you realize it's there. The wind had picked up after sunset, rattling the shutters and pushing through the gaps in the walls. Outside, the cottonwood trees swayed in the dark, their branches scraping against each other like fingernails on wood. Inside the Caldwell house, the air was still. Margaret lay in her bed, listening. She had not meant to stay awake, but something about the night felt wrong. The silence was too heavy, the house too quiet, even with the wind outside. She could hear Lily breathing softly in the bed beside her, already asleep, her small body curled beneath the quilt. And above them, footsteps. Thomas had gone up to the loft just after 9 o'clock. Margaret had watched him from the doorway as he lit a candle, placed it in a tin holder, and carried it to the base of the ladder. He did not look at her, did not say goodnight. He simply climbed, one hand gripping the wooden rungs, the other holding the light steady. The ladder creaked under his weight. When he reached the top, he paused, crouched in the narrow opening and looked back down. For just a moment, his eyes met hers. There was something in his expression she had never seen before. Not fear, not sadness, resignation. Then he pulled himself up into the loft, and the darkness swallowed him whole. Margaret tried to sleep. She lay on her back, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds above her. At first, it was just the familiar scrape of wood being moved, the same sound she had heard for weeks. He was rearranging things, clearing space, doing whatever it was he had been doing up there night after night. But then, the sound changed. It became rhythmic, deliberate, like something being dragged across the floor in slow, careful strokes. Margaret sat up. The noise stopped. She waited, holding her breath. Then she heard his voice. He was speaking, low, measured, the way a man speaks when he knows he is being heard. She could not make out the words. The floorboards were too thick, the wind too loud, but the tone was unmistakable. He was not talking to himself. He was talking to someone. Margaret slipped out of bed, her feet cold against the wooden floor. She crossed the room slowly, careful not to wake Lily, and stood at the base of the ladder. She could see the faint glow of candlelight seeping through the gaps in the ceiling. She called up to him. "Papa." No answer. "Papa, are you all right?" The voice above her stopped. For a long moment there was nothing. Then she heard him move, a slow, shuffling step, and his face appeared in the opening above her, backlit by the candle. He looked down at her. His expression was calm, almost peaceful. "Go to bed, Margaret. What are you doing up there?" He did not answer right away. Then softly, "Keeping a promise." Before she could ask what he meant, he pulled back into the loft. The light disappeared, and Margaret, standing alone in the dark, felt something she would never be able to explain. A coldness that had nothing to do with the wind. She went back to bed, but she did not sleep. She lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the faint sounds of movement above her. The scraping had stopped. Now there was only the occasional creak of the floorboards, as though her father were pacing. Then, nothing. The silence was absolute. Margaret waited. Minutes passed. 5, 10. The wind outside had died down. The house had gone still. Even the trees had stopped moving. She sat up again, slowly, and looked toward the ladder. The candlelight was gone. She told herself he had simply blown it out. that he had finished whatever he was doing and gone to sleep up there, the way he sometimes did when he worked late into the night. But something felt wrong. She climbed out of bed again and crossed the room. This time she did not call out. She simply stood at the base of the ladder, listening. No breathing, no movement, no sound at all. Margaret put her hand on the first rung. She hesitated. Then she began to climb. The loft was darker than she had ever seen it. The single window on the far wall let in only the faintest trace of moonlight, just enough to outline the shapes of the trunks and furniture stacked against the walls. The air smelled of dust and old wood and something else, something faint and metallic, like the smell of a coin held too long in a sweating palm. Margaret pulled herself up through the opening and stood, crouched beneath the low ceiling. "Papa." Her voice was barely a whisper. No answer. She moved forward, her hands outstretched, feeling her way through the dark. Her fingers brushed against the corner of a trunk, the edge of a chair, the rough wool of a folded blanket. And then her foot hit something. She stopped, looked down. In the faint light from the window, she could just make out the shape on the floor. The candle, burned down to nothing, and beside it, the letters, stacked neatly, one on top of the other, all of them addressed to Clara in her father's careful handwriting. Margaret knelt down and picked up the top letter. Her hands were shaking. She could not read it in the dark, but she did not need to. She knew what it was. She knew what all of this meant. She stood, turning slowly, scanning the room. The trunks were still there, the broken furniture, Clara's old dresses hanging from a nail in the wall. But her father, he was gone. Margaret searched the loft 3 times that night. She moved every trunk, checked every corner, pressed her hands against the walls, looking for loose boards, hidden spaces, anything that might explain where he had gone. The window was latched from the inside. The floor was solid. There was no other way out. And yet, Thomas Caldwell was not there. When the sun rose on October 17th, Margaret climbed down from the loft and woke her sister. She did not tell Lily what she had found. She simply said, "Papa's gone." Lily, still half asleep, asked where he had gone. Margaret did not answer. She walked to the door, opened it, and stepped out into the cold morning air. The yard was empty. The road was empty. There were no footprints in the dirt. No sign that anyone had left the house at all. By mid-morning, the neighbors had been called. By afternoon, a search party had been organized. They combed the woods, checked the creek, knocked on doors for miles in every direction. No one had seen Thomas Caldwell. No one had heard anything unusual. It was as though he had simply ceased to exist. But Margaret knew better. She had heard him speaking. She had seen the look in his eyes, and she had found the letters. Whatever her father had been doing in that loft, whatever promise he had made, whatever debt he believed he owed, he had paid it. The town did not know what to make of it. A man does not simply vanish from a locked room in the middle of the night. He does not leave behind 2 daughters, a cold stove, and a house that shows no sign of struggle. He does not disappear without a coat, without boots, without a single footprint in the dirt outside his door. And yet, Thomas Caldwell had done exactly that. The sheriff, a man named William Hackett, arrived at the house on the morning of October 18th. He was in his 50s, gray-haired and practical, the kind of man who believed in facts over speculation. He questioned Margaret for over an hour, asking her to repeat the events of that night again and again, searching for inconsistencies. She told him everything: the sounds from the loft, the voice, the candle, the letters. Hackett listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked to see the loft. He climbed the ladder slowly, his boots heavy on the rungs. Margaret waited below, her arms wrapped around Lily, who had not stopped crying since the search began. Hackett spent nearly 30 minutes up there. When he came back down, his face was unreadable. "There's no way out," he said quietly. "The window's latched. The floor's solid. If your father went up there, he didn't leave by any normal means." Margaret said nothing. Hackett looked at her for a long moment, then added, "But men don't just disappear, Miss Caldwell. There's always an explanation." She wanted to believe him. But she had been in that loft. She had felt the silence. And she knew, in a way she could not explain, that her father was not coming back. The search continued for 3 more days. Volunteers combed the surrounding farmland, checked abandoned barns, dragged the creek. A few men even traveled into Springfield asking shopkeepers and stable hands if they had seen a man matching Thomas's description. Nothing. On the 4th day, the search was called off. Sheriff Hackett filed a report with the county, listing Thomas Everett Caldwell as a missing person. The case remained open, but no further action was taken. There were no leads, no witnesses, no body, just an empty house and 2 orphaned girls. The rumors started almost immediately. Some said Thomas had run off with another woman, that the grief over Clara had been an act, and he had been planning his escape for months. Others claimed he had debts no one knew about, that he owed money to dangerous men and had fled to avoid paying. A few whispered darker things, that he had gone mad with grief and walked into the woods to die, that he had thrown himself into the river, that he had done something to himself in that loft, and Margaret was protecting his memory by lying about what she had seen. But none of these explanations fit. Thomas had no debts, no enemies, no history of instability. And the loft told a different story. Margaret refused to let anyone else go up there. She told the sheriff, the neighbors, even the pastor who came to offer prayers. She told all of them that the loft was private, that it was her father's space, and she would not allow it to be disturbed. Hackett did not push her. He had seen the letters. He had read enough to understand that Thomas Caldwell had been a man wrestling with something far beyond the sheriff's jurisdiction. Grief, perhaps, guilt, or something else entirely. In the weeks that followed, Margaret read every letter her father had written. There were 11 in total, each one dated, each one addressed to Clara. They were not long. Thomas had never been a man of many words, but what he wrote was clear enough. In the first letter, dated August 3rd, 1891, he wrote, "I have tried to forget. I have tried to move forward, but I can feel it, Clara. The weight of what I promised. It does not leave me. It grows heavier with each passing day." In the 5th letter, dated September 12th, "I have begun to hear you, not in dreams, not in memory. I hear you in the house, in the walls, in the spaces between sounds. You are calling me back." In the 9th letter, dated October 9th, "I know what I must do. I have known for some time. I only wished I could have stayed longer, for the girls, for the life we built. But a promise is a promise, and I will not break it again." And in the final letter, written the night he disappeared, "Forgive me, Clara. I'm coming home." Margaret showed the letters to no one. She kept them locked in a drawer, hidden beneath her own small collection of keepsakes. She did not know what her father had promised. She did not know what he believed he owed. But she understood one thing clearly. He had gone willingly. Whatever had taken him from that loft, whether it was madness or faith or something neither she nor anyone else could name, he had wanted to go. There was one other detail, something Margaret did not tell the sheriff, something she did not tell anyone for many years. On the morning of October 17th, when she first climbed into the loft and found it empty, she had noticed something strange. The blanket on the floor, the one folded neatly beside the candle, it was damp, not soaked, not wet, just damp, as though it had been touched by mist. And the smell, the faint metallic smell she had noticed the night before, it was stronger near the blanket, like iron, like blood. But there was no blood, no stain, nothing visible at all. Margaret never went back into the loft after that. She and Lily moved in with an aunt in Bloomington 2 months later. The house was sold to a family from Ohio. They lived there for 6 years before moving away, citing nothing more than a desire for a change of scenery. The house changed hands 3 more times over the next 2 decades. Each family stayed less than 5 years. None of them reported anything unusual. But none of them, Margaret later learned, ever used the loft. In 1909, when Margaret was 32 years old and living in Chicago, she received a letter from a man named Edgar Finch. He was a historian, he said, compiling records of unusual disappearances in the Midwest during the late 19th century. He had come across the case of Thomas Caldwell. He wanted to know if she would be willing to speak with him. Margaret agreed. They met in a small cafe near Union Station. Finch was younger than she expected, mid-30s, clean-shaven, with sharp eyes and a notebook he never stopped writing in. He asked her to recount the events of October 1891. She did. When she finished, he set down his pen and looked at her. "Do you believe your father is dead, Miss Caldwell?" She thought about it for a long time. Then she said, "No." "Then where do you think he is?" She met his eyes. "I think he's exactly where he wanted to be." Finch published his findings in a small academic journal in 1911. The article was titled, "Vanishings Without Trace, 3 Cases from Rural Illinois, 1880-1895. The case of Thomas Caldwell took up less than 2 pages. It concluded with a single line. "No explanation, natural or otherwise, has ever been satisfactorily determined." Margaret Caldwell died in 1954 at the age of 77. She had lived a quiet life. She married once, briefly, in her 30s. No children. She worked as a seamstress in Chicago for nearly 40 years, stitching hems and mending coats in a small shop on Halsted Street. She kept to herself. She did not speak often of her childhood, but she never forgot. In the final years of her life, as her health began to fail, she moved into a modest boarding house on the South Side. The landlady, a woman named Mrs. Iris Coleman, later described Margaret as polite, reserved, and prone to long silences. She spent most of her time sitting by the window looking out at the street, watching, waiting. For what? Mrs. Coleman never knew. Among Margaret's belongings, found after her death, was a small wooden box. Inside were 3 things. A photograph of her father, taken sometime in the early 1880s. He is standing in front of the house, his face serious, his hands at his sides. Behind him, barely visible in the window, is the shadow of a woman. Clara, perhaps, or just a trick of the light. A lock of hair, tied with a faded ribbon. No name, no date, but Margaret had kept it for over 60 years. And the letters, all 11 of them, still in their envelopes, still addressed to Clara, still written in Thomas Caldwell's careful, deliberate hand. On the back of the final letter, in pencil, Margaret had written a single sentence. "He kept his word." Lily Caldwell, the younger sister, lived longer. She moved to California in 1920 and rarely spoke of Illinois again. She married a ranch hand named Samuel Ortiz and raised 4 children in a small town outside Bakersfield. She was, by all accounts, a warm and loving mother. She laughed easily. She sang in church. She baked bread every Sunday. But she would not allow ladders in her house. When her oldest son asked why, she only said, "Some places are not meant to be opened." She never explained what she meant. She died in 1972, at the age of 90. She left behind no journals, no letters, no record of her thoughts about that night in October 1891. Only silence. The house where Thomas Caldwell disappeared still stands. It has been renovated, of course. The wood has been replaced, the walls repainted, the roof re-shingled. It looks nothing like it did in 1891, but the loft is still there. In 1987, a family named the Pritchards bought the property. They were young, optimistic, eager to restore what they saw as a piece of local history. They spent months researching the house, tracing its ownership back through county records. That was how they found the name Thomas Caldwell. That was how they learned what had happened. The husband, a man named Daniel Pritchard, was fascinated. He read everything he could find. Old newspaper clippings, census records, the article Edgar Finch had written in 1911. He became convinced that there was more to the story, that something had been overlooked. He wanted to go up into the loft. His wife Ellen did not. She could not explain why. But every time Daniel mentioned it, she felt a tightness in her chest, a coldness that settled in her bones. "Leave it alone," she told him. He did not listen. On a Saturday afternoon in November 1987, Daniel Pritchard climbed the ladder to the loft. He brought a flashlight, a tape measure, and a camera. He wanted to document the space, to see if there was anything, any clue. any trace that might explain what had happened to Thomas Caldwell nearly a century earlier. Ellen stayed downstairs. She heard him moving around up there. She heard the scrape of wood, the click of the camera, his footsteps crossing the floor. Then, silence. She waited. 5 minutes. 10. She called up to him. No answer. She climbed the ladder. The loft was empty. Daniel's flashlight was on the floor, still lit. The camera was beside it, lens cap off, untouched. The tape measure lay coiled near the window. But Daniel, he was gone. Ellen Pritchard called the police. They searched the property, the woods, the surrounding fields. They found nothing. No footprints, no sign of struggle, no explanation. The case was filed as a missing person. It remains open to this day. The house has been empty since 1988. The county tried to sell it twice. Both times the buyers backed out before closing. One cited financial reasons. The other offered no explanation at all. In 2003, a local preservation society considered turning it into a historical site. They sent a team to assess the structure. None of them would go into the loft. When asked why, the lead surveyor, a man with 30 years of experience, said only, "It doesn't feel right." The project was abandoned. There are those who say the house is cursed, that Thomas Caldwell made a deal he should not have made, and the loft is the place where that deal was kept. Others say it is simply grief, that a man, broken by loss, convinced himself of something that was not real, and in convincing himself, made it real. But the truth, if there is one, remains locked in that small, dark space beneath the slanted roof, in the letters that were never answered, in the silence that followed. In 2019, a journalist named Sarah Tyndall traveled to the house to write a feature for a regional magazine. She stood in the yard for over an hour, looking up at the window of the loft. She did not go inside. In her article, published that December, she wrote, "There are places in this world that hold on to the past in ways we do not understand. Places where time does not move forward, but circles back, endlessly, waiting for something, or someone, to return." The Caldwell house is one of those places, and whatever happened there in 1891 is still happening, slowly, quietly, in the space between what we see and what we cannot explain. Margaret Caldwell believed her father kept his promise. Lily Caldwell believed some doors should never be opened. Ellen Pritchard believes her husband is still out there, somewhere waiting. And the house remembers. There are disappearances that leave behind questions. And then there are disappearances that leave behind silence. The kind of silence that does not ask to be filled. The kind that simply waits. In October 1891, Thomas Everett Caldwell climbed a ladder into a loft and never came back down. No one knows where he went. No one knows what he found. But in the years since, on certain nights, cold nights, when the wind is still and the moon is low, people walking past that house have reported hearing something. Not a voice, not a footstep, just the faint creak of a ladder and the soft scrape of wood being moved across a floor that should be empty. What they found inside the loft was never meant to be seen. But some things, once opened, cannot be closed again.